Dracula by Bram Stoker, Chapter 22 continued, Jonathan Harker's Journal. When we came from the discussion of the sequence of our efforts and of the disposition of our forces, there were new sources of doubt. It was finally agreed that before starting for Piccadilly we should destroy the Count's lair close at hand. In case he should find out too soon, we should thus be ahead of him in our work of destruction, and his presence in his purely material shape, and at his weakest, might give us new clue. As to the disposal of forces, it was suggested by the Professor that, after our visit to Carfax, we should enter the house in Piccadilly, that the two doctors and I should remain there, whilst Lord Godalming and Quincy found the lairs at Walworth and Mile End, and destroyed them. It was possible, if not likely, the Professor urged, that the Count might appear in Piccadilly during the day, and that if so we might be able to cope with him then and there. At any rate, we might be able to follow him in force. To this plan I strenuously objected, in so far as my going was concerned, for I said that I intended to protect Mina and stay here. I thought that my mind was made up on the subject, but Mina would not listen to my objection. She said that there might be some law matter in which I could be useful, that amongst the Count's papers might be some clue which I could understand out of my experience in Transylvania, and that, as it was, all the strength we could muster was required to cope with the Count's extraordinary power. I had to give in, for Mina's resolution was fixed. She said that it was the last hope for her that we should work together. "As for me," she said, "I have no fear. Things have been as bad as they can be, and whatever may happen must in some element be of hope or comfort. Go, my husband. God can, if he wishes, guard me as well alone as with anyone present." So I started up, crying out, "Then in God's name let us come at once, for we are losing time. The Count may come to Piccadilly earlier than we think." "Not so," said Van Helsing, holding up his hand. "But why?" I asked. "Do you forget," he said with an actual smile, "that last night he banqueted heavily, and will sleep late?" I did forget. Shall I ever, can any of us ever forget? That terrible scene. Mina struggled so hard to keep her brave countenance, but the pain overmastered her, and she put her hands before her face, and shuddered while she moaned. Van Helsing had not intended to recall her frightful experience. He had simply lost sight of her and her part in the affair in his intellectual effort. When it struck him what he had said, he was horrified at his thoughtlessness, and tried to comfort her. "Oh, Madam Mina," he said, "dear, dear Madam Mina, alas, that I, of all who so reverence you, should have said anything so forgetful. These stupid old lips of mine, this stupid old head, not to so deserve. But you will forget it, will you not?" He bent low beside her as he spoke. She took his hands, and looking at him through her tears, said hoarsely, "No, I shall never forget, for it is well that I remember, and with it I have so much in memory of you that is sweet, that I take it all together. Now you must all be going soon. Breakfast is ready, and we must all eat, so that we may be strong." Breakfast was a strange meal to us all. We tried to be cheerful and encourage each other, and Mina was the brightest and most cheerful of us. When it was over, Van Helsing stood up and said, "Now, my dear friends, we go forth to our terrible enterprise. Are we all armed as we were on the night when we first visited our enemy's lair, armed against the ghastly ghost we all carnal attack?" We assured him. "Then it is well. Now, Madam Mina, you are in any case quite safe here until the sunset, and before then we shall return. We shall return, but before we go, let me see you armed against personal attack. I have myself, since you came down, prepared your chamber by placing the things of which we know, so that he may not enter. Now let me guard yourself. On your forehead touch this piece of sacred wafer, in the name of the Father, the Son, and—" There was a fearful scream, which almost froze our hearts to hear, as he placed the wafer on Mina's forehead. It seared, had burned into the flesh, as though it had been a piece of white-hot metal. My poor darling's brain told her the significance of the fact as quickly as the nerves received the pain of it, and the two so overwhelmed her that her overwrought nature had its voice in that dreadful scream. But the words to her thought came quickly. The echo of the scream had not ceased to ring in the air when there came the reaction, and she sank on her knees, onto the floor in agony of abasement. Pulling her beautiful hair over her face as the leper of his old mantle, she wailed out, "Unclean, unclean, even the Almighty shuns my polluted flesh. I must bear this mark of shame upon my forehead until the judgment day." They all paused. I had thrown myself beside her in an agony of helpless grief, putting my arms around her tight. For a few minutes our sorrowful hearts beat together, whilst the friends around us turned away their eyes, that ran tears silently. Then Van Helsing turned and said gravely, so gravely that I could not help feeling that he was in some way inspired and was stating things outside himself, "It may be that you have to bear that mark till God himself see fit, as he most surely shall on judgment day to redress all wrongs on the earth and his children that he placed thereon. And oh, Madam Mina, my dear, dear, may we who have loved you be there to see, when that red scar, that sign of God's knowledge of what has been, shall pass away and leave your forehead as pure as the heart we know. For surely as we live, that scar shall pass away when God see right to lift the burden that is hard upon us. Till then we bear our cross, and his Son did in obedience to his will. It may be we are chosen instruments of his good pleasure, and that we ascend to his bidding as that other through stripes and shame, through tears and blood, through doubts and fears, and that makes the difference between God and man." There was hope in his words and comfort. They made for resignation. Mina and I both felt so, and simultaneously we took one of the old man's hands and bent over and kissed it. Then without a word we all knelt down together, and, all holding hands, swore to be true to each other. We men pledged ourselves to raise the veil of sorrow from the head of her, whom, in his own way, we loved. We prayed for help and guidance in this terrible task which lay before us. It was then time to start, so I said farewell to Mina, a parting which neither of us shall forget to our dying day, and we set out. To one thing I have made up my mind. If we find out that Mina must be a vampire in the end, then she shall not go into that unknown and terrible land alone. I suppose it is thus that in old times one vampire meant many. Just as their hideous bodies could only rest in sacred earth, so the holiest love was the recruiting sergeant for their ghastly ranks. We entered Carfax without trouble, and found all things the same at the first occasion. It was hard to believe that among so prosaic surroundings and with neglect and dust and decay that there was any ground for such fears we already knew. Had not our minds been made up, and had there not been terrible memories to spur us on, we could hardly have proceeded with our task. We found no papers nor any sign of use in the house, and in the old chapel the great boxes looked just as we had seen them last. Dr. Van Helsing said to us solemnly, as we stood before them, "And now, my friends, we have a duty here to do. We must sterilize the earth, so sacred of holy memories, that he has brought from a far distant land for such fell use. He has chosen this earth because it has been holy. Thus we defeat him with his own weapon, for we make it more holy still. It was sanctified to such use of man, now we sanctify it to God." As he spoke he took from his bag a screwdriver and wrench, and very soon the top of one of the cases was thrown open. The earth smelled musty and close, but we did not somehow seem to mind, for our attention was concentrated on the professor. Taking from his box a piece of the sacred wafer, he laid it reverently on the earth, and then, shutting down the lid, began to screw it home. We aiding him as he worked. One by one we treated in the same way each of the great boxes, and left them as we found them to all appearance, but in each was a portion of the host. When we closed the door behind us, the professor said solemnly, "So much is already done. If it may be that with all the others we can be so successful, then the sunset of this evening may shine on Madam Mina's forehead, all white as ivory, and with no stain." As we passed across the lawn on our way to the stations to catch our train, we could see the front of the asylum. I looked eagerly, and in the window of my room saw Mina. I waved my hand to her, and nodded to tell her our work here was successfully accomplished. She nodded in reply, so that she understood. The last I saw she waved her hand in farewell. It was with a heavy heart that we sought the station and caught the train, It was steaming in as we reached the platform. I've written this in the train. Piccadilly, 12:30 o'clock. Just before we reached Fenchurch Street, Lord Godalming said to me, "Quincy, I will find a locksmith. You had better not come with us in case there should be any difficulty. For under the circumstances it wouldn't seem so bad for us to break into an empty house. But you are a solicitor, and the Incorporated Law Society might tell you that you should have known better." I demurred as to my not sharing any danger, even of odium, but he went on. "Besides, it will not attract less attention if there are not too many of us. My title will make it all right with the locksmith, as with any policeman that may come along. You'd better go with Jack and the Professor and stay in the Green Park, somewhere in sight of the house. Then when you see the door open, Smith has gone away, do you all come across. We shall be on the lookout for you, and will let you in." "This advice is good," said Van Helsing, so we said no more. Godalming and Morse hurried off in a cab, and followed in another. At the corner of Arlington Street our contingent got out, and strolled into the Green Park. My heart beat as I saw the house on which so much of our hope was centred, looming up grim and silent in its deserted condition amongst its more lively and spruce-looking neighbours. We sat down on a bench within a good view, and began to smoke cigars so as to attract as little attention as possible. The minutes seemed to pass with laden feet as we waited for the coming of the others. At length we saw a four-wheeler drive up. Out of it in leisurely fashion got Lord Godalming and Miss Morris, and got down from the box descended a thick-set working-man with his rush-woven basket of tools. Morris paid the cabman, who touched his hat and drove away. Together the two ascended the steps, and Lord Godalming pointed out what he wanted done. The workman took off his coat leisurely and hung it on one of the spikes of the railing, saying something to a policeman who just then sauntered along. The policeman nodded and acquiesced, and the man, kneeling down, placed his bag beside him. After searching through it, he took out a selection of tools which he proceeded to lay beside him in orderly fashion. Then he stood up, looked into the keyhole, blew into it, and turning to his employers made some remark. Lord Godalming smiled, and the man lifted a good-sized bunch of keys. Selecting one of them, he began to probe the lock, as if feeling his way with it. After fumbling for a bit he tried a second, and then a third, and at once the door opened under a slight push from him, and he and the two others entered the hall. We sat still, my own cigar burnt furiously, but Van Helsing's went cold altogether. We waited patiently as we saw the workman come out, and in his bag. Then he held the door partly open, studying it with his knees, whilst he fitted a key to the lock. This he finally handed to Lord Godalming, who took out his purse and gave him something. The man touched his hat, took his bag, and put on his coat, and departed. Not a soul took the slightest notice of the whole transaction. When the man had fairly gone, we three crossed the street and knocked at the door. It was immediately opened by Quincy Morris, beside whom stood Lord Godalming lighting a cigar. "This place smells so vilely," said the latter as we came in. It did indeed smell vilely, like the old chapel at Carfax. And with our previous experience it was plain to us that the Count had been using the place pretty freely. We moved to explore the house, all keeping together in case of attack, for we knew we had a strong and wily enemy to deal with. And as yet we did not know whether the Count might not be in the house. In the dining room, which lay in the back of the hall, we found 8 boxes of earth. 8 boxes, only out of the 9 which we sought. Our work was not over, and we could never be until we should have found the missing box. First we opened the shutters of the window, which looked out across a narrow stone-flagged yard, at the blank face of a stable, pointed to look like the front of a miniature house. There were no windows, so we were not afraid of being overlooked. We did not lose any time in examining the chests, the tools which we had brought with us, and opened them, one by one, and treated them as we had treated those in the chapel. It was evident to us that the Count was not present in the house, and we proceeded to search for any of his effects. After a cursory glance at the rest of the rooms from the basement to attic, we came to the conclusion that the dining-room contained any effects which might belong to the Count, and so we proceeded to minutely examine them. They lay in a sort of orderly disorder on the great dining-room table. There were title deeds in the Piccadilly house in a great bundle, deeds of the purchase of the houses at Mile End and Bermondsey, note-paper, envelopes, and pens and ink. All were covered up in thin wrapping paper to keep them from the dust. There were also clothes, a brush and a comb. a jug and a basin, the latter containing dirty water which was reddened as if with blood. Last of all was a little heap of keys of all sorts and sizes, probably those belonged to the other houses. When we had examined this last find, Lord Godalming and Quincy Morris, taking accurate notes of the various addresses of the houses in the east and the south, took with them the keys in a great bunch, and set out to destroy the boxes in these places. The rest of us are, with that patience we can, awaiting their return, or the coming of the Count.